Thank you for joining us today for what will be an insightful panel called At the Vanguard, How Women Lead the Charge in Researching Influence Operations. I'm Alicia Wanless, Director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As a researcher in this space, and having worked in both tech and security, it's always struck me how many women are leading the way in our collective understanding of influence operations. There are far more than we could comfortably fit on this panel, and today is but a representative sampling. While women lead the way in researching influence operations, their leadership comes at a cost. Often identifying and exposing nefarious campaigns that seek to discredit others, influence operations researchers frequently become targets themselves. A study from late last year by the International Center of Journalists in UNESCO found that 73% of women journalists and media workers have experienced online abuse. Moreover, 20% of those women journalists reported experiencing abuse in the physical world that they believe is connected to the online violence targeting them. It's clear that women face unique challenges online, and the stakes are even greater for those women exposing online abuses. Today, I'm honored to host three remarkable women who research and expose influence operations. Maria Ressa is a leading journalist in Asia whose reporting career has spanned over 35 years. She's the co-founder of Rappler, the top digital-only news site that is leading the fight for press freedom in the Philippines. Luiza Bandeira is an associate editor at the Atlantic Council's DFR lab, where she works to expose and explain disinformation. Previously, she's worked as a journalist for the BBC's World Service, among others. And last but not least, Shireen Mitchell is an award-winning social entrepreneur and founder of Stop Online Violence Against Women, as well as Digital Sisters, an organization focused on women and girls of color in technology and digital media. She's also a member of the independent Facebook Oversight Board. Today, these inspiring women will share their experiences leading the charge to understand influence operations. We'll hopefully explore what drew them to this field, what are some of the challenges they face, and how can women be better protected online. Ladies, welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for the invitation.
We're glad to have you. In North America, we hear most about influence operations related to the US elections, but influence operations occur in a plethora of contexts. You each study influence operations in the context of race, gender, and geopolitics. Maria, can you speak perhaps to the breadth of the overall problem and who seems to be perpetrating these types of campaigns?
It's huge, and thank you for asking. I think, just like when we were looking at terrorist operations and how they come together, oftentimes something that is set up for local gets used for global. Al-Qaeda took homegrown operations and kind of use the same networks for its own purposes. Well, that's kind of what's happening on influence operations online. Here in the Philippines, we saw the state-sponsored, what's the right word? Encouraged. We've seen these, but those are also the same networks that were used for anti-vax operations, the same networks that were then used for what will I call them? Well, very simply, Russian disinformation and Chinese disinformation, right? Even though there are very specific ones that come in, they tend to all work together.
That's an interesting point, and I'm curious off the top, and we'll move on to some other questions. Why do you think that is?
I think when you create a disinformation operation, a disinformation network, again, I'll go back to terrorist research. These disinformation networks pump out lies, and the lies that are pumped out on social media in particular create alternate worlds. The lies over time become conspiracy theories. They create worldviews. It's like being infected by a virus of lies. And when you're infected, there's a contagion, but it changes the way you look at the world. That's kind of what we've seen, right? That's what we've seen throughout. So here in the Philippines, it was, let's say, Duterte is the best leader all around the world. You pound it a million times, it shifts the worldview. Then a hop, skip, and a jump to measles, Right. It is not a coincidence that the Philippines had an outbreak of measles right about the same time the entire anti-vax operations went up. We found in January 2018, looking at the data that was released in December 2018 by the US Senate, the links between the disinformation networks that were state controlled, state sponsored in the Philippines, linked to Russian disinformation. And that is, and I guess the simplest thing, it's about power and money.
And I just want to highlight that because people don't understand is that once they know they have a hold on a community, the goal is to just keep that hold going about that disinformation for as long as they can. And so if they stop it at any point, it's not effective to them when they need it. So the goal is to keep that community network going. So when they need it again for something else that comes up, for whatever issue that is, if it's anti-vaxxer, if it's COVID lies, if it's political disinformation, which we deal with in America, all of those things are connected so that, you know, what I tell people here, that whole Stop the Steal that led up to our insurrection started in before 2016 as a hashtag that basically was seeded by Russia. So if you don't understand the through line about how that works and actually becomes offline harms, you're not paying attention to the whole history. And people typically cut off at a certain point where they think oh, this became domestic. No, it landed domestically. We captured it and used it, but this one didn't come from us. And so until you understand all of that and you understand that through line, you won't actually gather the history of this and be able to even inform people enough to stop some of it.
That's a really important point, Shireen, in that the information environment is already primed. I mean, and it has been for as long as, you know, we've been able to do that online. So it's a challenge. Luiza, I'm curious if you're seeing similar things in South America. And also, do you think that perhaps this might be because some of them are financially motivated actors, so they can turn on a dime?
Well, we are seeing similar things in South America and Latin America. But I think that here right now we see more of domestic disinformation. Of course, it is global, right? Especially now during the pandemic, we've seen many narratives that were going from one country to a different country. And we've seen that there was a local twist, but much of this was starting in other places. Still, when we look at Brazilians, so when we look at Brazil, for instance, Brazil was very isolated from the rest of the debate. It was like other countries were discussing, like there was some piece of disinformation that would be discussed and then debunked by fact checkers, and people would kind of get over it, and fact checkers would go ahead and verify something else. In Brazil, it was always the same thing. It was always about drugs that do not work against COVID that were being pushed and are still being pushed by the president, Jair Bolsonaro. So I think maybe the dynamics are similar, but we see a lot of like domestic disinformation here. You asked me another question. What was that, Alicia? Sorry.
No, it's fine. I was curious whether you were finding that the majority of these were, or at least a portion of them were financially motivated. And the theory behind that is that because if they're turning on topics pretty quickly, beyond being politically motivated, there may be another possibility there for what's driving them. Shireen, some of your work has spotlighted the role of race in influence operations. Can you share a bit about what's driving racially focused influence operations and what you've learned in your research?
Oh, absolutely. There's so many tiers to it, unfortunately, but what the ultimate goal is about division, ultimately, but it's also being used for the most marginalized. So the least protected are the most targeted or used in many of these campaigns, and most people don't realize that. So the reason that this is important is because when it comes to responses from government, responses from laws, from a legal perspective, responses from even these platforms, the most marginalized groups and the most targeted groups are the ones that are the least protected, which is why the information or influence campaigns can be successful. Because as long as there's no one stopping them because they are choosing a certain group of people to target, that others don't classify them as valuable enough to be concerned about, then that's how they continue. So a lot of the original, I tell people this all the time, most people know about Gamergate, right? Which is, in my opinion, it became a media awareness of that particular campaign. But before Gamergate, there was Donglegate, and before that, there were other campaigns that were targeting Black women, pretending to be Black women online. And when you don't know the full history, you assume it started at Gamergate, and that's why we got to where we are in America right now. And that's absolutely not true. And if you don't understand that Black women are the ones that get out the vote and change elections, which we've seen happen already, you don't understand why they started with us in the first place, because you don't get the fact that they have to overcome all those challenges, including the disinformation campaigns, and still come out on the other side successfully at some point with no protections and no support. And not understanding that, or not understanding anything about why they're targeted, and how early it starts, is like they're planning this all the way through other campaigns. There's no way to stop this. And it's really challenging, because a lot of these platforms will claim freedom of speech, but what they really mean is that, people who are inflicting harms, who are targeting certain groups of people, they have the right for that freedom of speech. But those of us speaking against those harms, trying to protect ourselves from those harms, our freedom of speech is all of a sudden not as important. And so when you see that model, that's how disinformation can seed and grow. And when we're the truth tellers and trying to change a narrative, we're also the ones discredited the most and the least believed. So then it can spread even further. So that's why the race connotation is really important in this, in terms of even the most marginalized groups.
Thank you. And that's a perfect transition to explore what you've been experiencing, all of you, in terms of your research. Maria, in a recent report by the International Center for Journalists on Harassment, you face, in response to your work, they found you received over 90 hateful posts on Facebook Messenger alone in just 1 hour. Why do you think this is happening? And that was a pretty basic question. I think we all know, but if you could share your experiences there, that would be appreciated. You're muted.
I should unmute myself first, right? It was clear why I was targeted, because I am a cautionary tale for journalists. You open your mouth, you will get pounded. And the end goal of being pounded, actually there are two reasons for it. The first is to hit it's people who are vulnerable, right? And you're attacked to pound you to silence. That's the first. And the second is to create a bandwagon effect, right? To make other people believe whatever that meta narrative is that's being seeded. I was attacked at that point, and this was in 2016. I was attacked because we came out with the weaponization of the internet series. 2 out of the 3 parts were written by me. The data showed that hate was being used to pound people to silence. And I think the biggest problem there is, to pick up on what Shireen said, is that ICFJ report showed that 60% of the attacks were tearing down credibility I built up over decades working as a journalist. But the other 40% was sexist, misogynistic, dehumanizing. It was meant to tear me down, to push me so that I would on my own shut up, right? And so I think if you realize that, the reason why it was important for me to understand that is because I couldn't have fought back if I didn't have the data. If I didn't understand why it was happening, then I might have thought it was my fault, which I did at the beginning, for the record.
I mean, it's so challenging. How do you manage to stay motivated and so positive? Because you are very inspirational all around, but definitely in terms of maintaining a positive attitude about this.
As are, all of you. I mean, why? At the beginning, it's shocking, and you realize this is a brand new weapon. And then that was 2016, it's 2021. And look at that meta narrative that was seeded in 2016, journalist equals criminal. I laughed about it in 2016. I was convicted in 2020, right? So look at that time over those 4 years. And again, a lie told 1 million times on social media becomes a fact. It changes our reality. So the sexist, misogynistic, dehumanizing lies that are pounded, they change. They are like a virus that infects real people. And so, well, look, I am not answering your question. How do I stay positive? Because it's a new attack. Because I know that if I know what is happening, I'm going to fight back. Because everything depends on how we fight back at this moment in time, and what we do matters. We demand, like Shireen, we demand better from so many things. First, from the social media platforms that enable this, from the actual actors that use this for power plays, and then from, I mean, frankly, it's like the broken glass theory, from the people who sit in silence, accepting it.
Yeah, absolutely. Shireen, Luiza, I'm curious, what have been the additional consequences of you undertaking this work, both, you know, online and offline, and also how are you managing to stay strong to keep doing this? We'll start with Shireen.
Okay, I was going to let Luiza go first. So, so the key question here, just like Maria, it's like my attacks don't stop. Ever since I started tracking this in 2014, you know, I was already being attacked slightly. It was probably the culmination of Gamergate and what happened at an event at South by Southwest, where it took on a more public stance, where I was attacked everywhere from that moment on. And then when I started working on this disinformation for digital vote suppression and political campaigns, it just exploded more from there. It was like sort of a domino effect that just like now that's like an everyday thing. And I can go just about anywhere online and people know my name. I've heard people say, even when I poke into Clubhouse, if someone said they had my name in their bio to say, you know, someone you should listen to or talk to, they would get kicked out of rooms because people know who I am. And so if anyone's in support of me, they don't want those people around. So it's very interesting to see that. But yes, so for me, like every morning I have to wake up to how many attempted hacks there are, how many threats, how much harassment that I received in one way or another. But that's just, you know, for me now, it's just a normal practice to my day when I wake up in the morning, just like when I go look at social media, and when I dig deeper into these disinformation campaigns, which I'm not going to stop doing. But it's definitely challenging for those who feel like that I'm the one spreading the disinformation about the people who are the ones spreading the disinformation. So it becomes this. What I'm dealing with now is like this opposite effect, where it's like, no, you're the one not telling the truth. And that everyone else is, when basically we know that the ratio of disinformation is 6-1, right? So what people see the most is the disinformation, and everyone doesn't, people don't understand that. So I try to get people to get it. It's like dig deeper than some of the things you see. Even if you think I'm not telling the truth, dig deeper in what I'm saying too. If you want to, if you want to even that out. But we're collecting the data. We're looking at the narrative shifts. We're watching where it goes next. We're watching which communities are now being divided. Like right now, we're watching the division between Asian Americans and Black Americans, right? All of that is seated in already community divisions that's now being elevated by disinformation. So it's like an everyday thing to have to worry about, not only which campaigns now I have to look at, but also if someone is looking at any of my work or talking about any one of those topics, my mentions will go crazy for a minute. And I'm just like, okay, somebody mentioned my name or mentioned my work or something, because here they come. And they'll drudge up even some of the oldest disinformation campaigns about me to do so. And so that becomes just like a casual thing I have to deal with every day. But how do I stay positive and strong is that I know that the reason that these people are coming after me is because I'm doing the right thing, and I will continue to do so.
And thank you for doing it. Nobody should have to live like this, online or offline. It's completely unacceptable. Luiza, what have been some of the consequences of your work in this space, and how do you stay strong?
Okay, so I do not face the same level of harassment as Shireen and Maria, which is, I think it's great for me. I think what's happening, partly because I've been dealing with this for ever since 2018, and I think also the environment in Brazil is changing a lot. It has changed a lot since 2018. When I look at the Philippines, what's happening in Brazil right now, it's very similar. There are people that face a lot of harassment, and it's like a cautionary tale. We know that this is the way that it's going to be in Brazil. What I faced I think the worst situation was last year when we, in partnership with Facebook, we wrote an article explaining how employees and staffers that were very close to Jair Bolsonaro and his family, they were behind this information network or propaganda network, coordinated network on Facebook and Instagram. And then because of that, I received a lot of threats online, and I was really worried about the offline world. Actually, Brazil is a very violent country, and unfortunately, we have urban paramilitary groups that have ties to the Bolsonaro family. So he was the neighbor of one of them. They have honored these people with awards. They have hired these people. So it's a fact of being very nervous about what can happen, like in the offline world, in the real world, whether you're going to be facing violence. And my family, I do not live in Brazil, so my work is a little bit easier because of that. But I have my family to protect, right? And it's very scary because I've been a journalist for 12 years, and of course there was some level of harassment before social media. Even when it was like on comments on online outlets, I had never felt scared about my life. And now, because we have a different situation, a more authoritarian government, it was the first time that I felt really scared about my security and the security of my family. This is something that I think happens in all Latin American countries. Just to wrap up, I think it happens in many Latin American countries, and the institutions here are weaker, I would say. So security is a big issue for those that are working in the field here.
Well, and you've raised several key points. All of you have. One is that this isn't just happening online. This isn't like just a virtual episode that you're experiencing. This spills over. It is dangerous. It's physically dangerous. And also that there's a power imbalance. Often the people who are behind these campaigns have a lot of resources to be able to target, far more than any of the individuals who are taking on this work, even if they have a team behind them. So it's quite frightening. Luiza, how do you stay positive?
Well, I look at some examples like the women that are here in this panel, and I know that it's a work that we have to do. It's related to democracy. And I think there is, like, at least here in Brazil and in many countries in Latin America, we are at a turning point. This is the moment where we have to say, okay, this cannot be like that. And also, like, thinking about being a woman, I think this is a field that it's being made right now. It's being shaped, right? So it's good that we have many women working with that. And I think it's the time for women to say, we're not going to take this. This isn't acceptable. This is not only online, it also affects our lives offline, and also the other way around, right? So my experiences in the offline world, in the real world, also shape the way that I understand these attacks. Maybe a man can look at an attack and say, well, this has sexual connotation, but it's low intensity, it's not that serious. But I've dealt with many things in my real life that were really violent and really bad. So any comment like that, they're going to affect me a lot. So I think this is the moment for us. I stay positive because I think this is exactly the moment in which we have to act.
And I just want to add to this just a little bit in terms of that is that what Luiza is hinting at, just the same thing that happens to many of the Black women in America. You know, the first threats to Black women to get them to be quiet is to threaten their children, right? So they have to overcome that threat to be able to move forward in terms of keeping, you know, to continue the fight. And then for me, you know, in many instances, people have given my location if I was speaking at an event, and I've had people show up yelling disinformation in my face. And I'm like saying to these people, it's like, y'all proving to me that disinformation works because here you are showing up, you know, where a fake account sent you here, and you're basically saying things that came from a disinformation campaign that's not factual, but you are present, and you're showing me that it does impact real people, and that there's more of a campaign that people need to understand that when that turns into the violence offline, like what we had happen in Kensington. Where the organizing happened on Facebook and 2 people died, right? It's if you're not paying attention to those types of threats and actions and you know, campaigns that talk about shoot them all, there's a target group of people who was behind the shoot them all part. There's people who they're trying to go shoot, and if you're not paying attention to those harms and understanding what's happening online, you will not be protecting the people who will die at the end of the day. And it's unfortunate that sometimes we have to see that go that far for anyone to take action including the platforms or including our, especially here in America, our political system.
Alicia, can I add?
Yep.
Can I add to that that online violence leads to real world violence? That's something we all know, and the methodology is the same, whatever country you're in. In at least in our case, it was exponential bottom up attacks, and then that was followed by the same attacks coming top down from our president. And then after that, the levers of state, if it's state sponsored, the levers of state were then used. I don't think it's a coincidence that hashtag arrest Maria Ressa was seeded in 2017, in May 2017. It didn't trend that well then. So it took another 2 years before they actually arrested me. In less than 2 years, I've had the government my government has issued 10 arrest warrants. So I posted bail 10 times to be free. And the way they can get away with it, why people will accept it is because of the astroturfing bottom up. When people can't tell fact from fiction, when people don't know, when it's a bandwagon effect, kind of like what Shireen said. What we forget is that the ability, when people are given free reign to do bad things or to think, let's start with thinking bad things, right? When the demon inside you is unleashed and you're told, it's okay, you can do that. You have this hatred of women, or it didn't even start like that. You distrust women, okay, and you fan the flames. It's like you give you give permission to be your worst self. And then that takes on its own life when you find your own community. It's the mob rule taken to the nth degree. And when it is with the state, when the state sanctions it, it's really scary.
It's absolutely frightening.
I'm sorry. I just want to interject. I made a mistake. I said Kingston, and it was Kenosha. I just wanted to correct that. But I just want to also highlight what Maria is saying is that when it's just the people at one point, it's one thing. But when you see that transfer to politicians and people in power, then it changes the whole game.
And this is such an important point. Like so much of what happens in terms of online abuse would actually be illegal if it happened in the physical world, right? Like threats of violence aren't legal. You can't do that. Threats of rape, sending pictures that no woman wants to see is also exposure. So why are we not being protected online as, and again, there are some arguments for that there's abysmal protection for us in the physical world too, but come on, there are models that we can borrow from. Maybe now's a good time to move to more hope. So while there has been such a big and public push for more women to get into tech, a sector pretty dominated by men, the specific field of researching influence operations does have significantly more women. I'm curious to hear from each of you, why does this field go against the larger trend in tech? And maybe we'll start with Luiza for this one.
I think this question is super relevant because maybe if we can understand why this field is like that, then we can influence women's participation in the bigger field of tech, right? And I think there are some reasons. One that we mentioned now, which unfortunately is not that happy or like positive, but women are the target of harassment online all the time. So I think part of the burden of dealing with it is falling into women, and they are there trying to show, okay, this is the research, this is the data. Shireen has talked a lot about that. I have here the evidence, right? This is happening, this is targeting women. And I'm like, you become a researcher. There are so many people that just started out as bloggers and they had to become researchers because of all the harassment that they were facing, right? They had to expose the truth. They had to show who was behind it. But I also think there is something about the fact that this is kind of a new field, right? When we think about tech, women, we know that women are not encouraged to follow like STEM careers. They're not encouraged to work with math, science, tech, all of that. And because this is a new field, many people are coming from other areas of knowledge. I'm a journalist. I know that there are many people that are from the communications field that are there because they were studying propaganda and many of influence operations and what many people call fake news or disinformation it's propaganda. They were studying discourse. There are many people coming from international relations, because this is also a way of, it's a dispute of power between states, right? And I think this is really positive. We're adding a lot with the interdisciplinarity, and we're adding a lot with having women with their different skill sets, their different view of the world and of the topics. We are bringing topics that men would just simply not bring. But we have to stay vigilant, I think, because as this become a more established field, will it turn into a man-led field or not? We have to think about that. And I think we still have to worry about things that are happening in the overall tech sector. So I have the feeling that women are leading influence operation, the study of influence operations as well. But I don't know about, are women in leadership positions? Is there a pay gap in this field? So I still think it would be important for the field to start studying and understanding itself.
Those are extremely valid points. Shireen, how did you get into this space? Well, you have an organization that's been helping champion women in tech.
Yeah, so I would say that just from that first question, if you think about it, the campaign I talked about, Donglegate, was a Black woman who was speaking up about sexism in the tech industry at a conference. And of course, she was targeted. But, the reason is because I started with my, the first organization to get women and girls of color online into tech in '99. And I tell people all the time, the easiest part of my job was teaching the girls to code. The hardest part of my job was everybody else who had to deal with them. And I grew up that way. I started coding at 10, and still people will doubt the fact that I can code. And I'm way past 10 in the field. But so for me, it was like, once I started to see that pattern and saw the other aspects that were happening, like the reason that we have such a dearth of women, in particular in the tech industry, is because of this level of harassment, this level of distrust, this level of like basically saying that they don't have the same rights in the tech industry as a 22-year-old dropout from college, right? That they have to have like 3 and 4 degrees to be seen as valid. And then, as we just saw with Timnit, even that doesn't matter, being an expert in your field, right? That you'll get pushed out. So for me, when I think about the tech industry and the problems that we have, it's because it's been, mostly built by white and males who don't understand the lived experience of other people and continue to think that they're building things for themselves, where they can nudge us around, when we're basically saying that every time you build it this way, we've seen it over and over again, it does not protect everyone in the system. And even if we try to come up with, and I've done this too, trying to come up with use cases of technology to help build in those types of concerns or protections, there's resistance. There's a huge resistance, I think, has a lot to do with who are the ones also perpetrating these harms, right? I think there's we're not being honest about that. And that's something we need to deal with, because I've told people before, when I was being originally hacked in certain aspects, it became clear I was locking all the doors. And then at some point, with my online presence, if I'm locking all the doors from the outside and someone's still getting in, someone's inside the house doing it. And if you don't want to admit the fact that in some of these, companies, that some of that disinformation or doxing isn't coming from people who have access to that information inside the companies, we're not having the right conversation here, because that's the other part of this problem.
Yeah, I mean, there seem to be so many layers to this problem too, and unfortunately, when we're always online and always connected, it's also ever present. We don't really get to escape from this either. Maria, why do you think women have been attracted to this field, and how did you come to it?
It was defense. I mean, that was the first step. I studied the spread of the virulent ideology behind terrorism. It was a lot of my reporting for CNN. Before I left CNN, I looked at Al-Qaeda's networks in Southeast Asia, and then how it spread online, how this ideology spread online. So I looked at social network analysis. But I would point to 2 things. After I found out what was happening, and I realized that this is targeted, because I'm a journalist and we're exposing exactly how we are being manipulated, then I began to see a lot of the same things Shireen said. I mean, look, the Coded Bias, the film Coded Bias, which was last year at Sundance. A Thousand Cuts, which is a film about what Rappler has gone through in the Philippines, was at the Sundance Festival. Coded Bias, which is an MIT Media Lab researcher, Joy Bolamwini, if I get her name correctly, right? She was just doing an assignment on facial recognition and AI, and the AI couldn't recognize her face because she was Black and she's a woman. So there's your coded bias. And then you add to that, I got in some great conversations because The Social Dilemma was also in Sundance last year. But one of the co-founders of Flickr, her name is Katarina Fake. It's funny, her last name, right? She actually pointed out exactly what Shireen has said, is that it's an old boys club, or a young boys club, I suppose. And that even though she was already a founder, that it is difficult. She puts guardrails on some of the things because she knows the impact. If you are vulnerable and have been vulnerable in the past, unchecked, mob rule takes a toll on the weakest. So she had pointed this out, and actually a bunch of other women, who many of whom didn't really want to speak up yet at that point, were saying that if women were running it, it would be different. Maybe that's some of the things. Certainly Mark Zuckerberg's power is, there's nothing that matches that. And his a little bit more of enlightened self-interest on his part would have a massive impact on the rest of us.
Everybody should be forced to watch Misrepresentation. Good documentary if it hasn't been watched already. As a follow-on question to that, and given the fact that many women don't want to go into political careers because they don't want to face the harassment, do you think this will contribute to a pipeline issue where more girls are getting into tech and STEM and researching things like influence operations, but because of the targeted attacks, they might not see it as being worth it for a career path?
I hope we breed fighters, frankly. I mean, that's what we need right now, and I hope that we are now creating a world where silence is complicity, because that's the precipice the entire world is standing on. We speak because we're directly attacked. We have firsthand knowledge of it, and we want to tell people this is happening. But this isn't unique to women, to marginalized sectors. This is happening all throughout. And so if our information ecosystem is this tainted, all human endeavor will become impossible. Here's the last part of this, is that all of our processes in the old world, where naming and shaming was what we used to do, is completely useless in this new world. We lived in a world of scarcity before, where there were gatekeepers. In this world where it's a fire hose, and it's attention that is the scarce factor, naming and shaming doesn't work. So even the small things that we're doing, speaking to each other now, isn't enough. We've got to demand guardrails. We've got to demand accountability. We've got to demand that the laws in the real world exist in the virtual world.
Absolutely. Shireen?
I would add to that. And so I do agree. Like, once you come over the beginning portion of this, believe me, your skin is very tough and and can take the battles on in a completely different way. So I agree with Maria in that perspective. We need women to fight the fight, because it's an important fight. But not everyone can do that, so I don't push that. But I do want to get at what I think Maria is saying, is that the influence part is the key to this word, the word influence, right? If you're allowing a specific group of people to build influence, build following, allow that false amplification, then that becomes the power dynamic against those who have the most marginalized voices. And if you have a system, and I say this, as someone who got deplatformed from YouTube, I got deplatformed from YouTube in 2009 talking about diversity in the tech industry. Like that conversation is the conversation that free speech is not acceptable for. But the conspiracy theorists and the racists, they can build a platform, build a following, get verified, and everything is fine. But until people realize that once they do that, then whoever they decide to target, there's a whole network there going after those people. And so until you understand that the flip of that power dynamic, we won't be able to get there. And we still need people who can try to counter that narrative. But yes, like what Maria said, it's really important to understand that the power dynamics have changed from a political perspective, but also from an influence perspective as well. And until we face that reality, it'll be hard to solve as well.
And sometimes it's the reporting functions that are used against people, right? Like there are things that were baked in that were meant to protect other users that are being turned on them. Luiza?
No, I was just going to say that I am really concerned about the thing about the burden being on women, right? So I do agree that we need to speak out and we need to talk. But I also want to point fingers at people that already have power, right? Because if we talk like thinking about Brazil and Latin America, there are so many people that don't even have access to the internet. Like here in Brazil, in Colombia, in other countries, people have WhatsApp and that's it. So their word is like filtered through WhatsApp. How am I going to expect them to fight? Of course, they are doing what they can, but I think we need to say, okay, women, please come to the field. We need you. It's good that you're here if you're being harassed. But I also understand that this is not something that everyone can do. So I think we need to say, okay, you, like people that are in power, you need to do something about it.
Absolutely. And as a community, we should also be here for each other. I think there's much to be drawn from the strength of the great women in this space. I'll ask another question and then we'll turn it over to the audience to see if we have some. Of course, I have many unending ones anyway. But so a question for all of you, and we can start with Maria again. What do you think are some of the practical ways the internet can become a better place for the women, both in short term and long term? What would be your top recommendation?
Regulations, Alicia, this is a shift for me for the last few years. In 2016 to about 2018, I thought that the social media platforms would be able to, like journalists, regulate themselves. But I realized the business model is different, and standards and ethics are different. So their goal was never to be the gatekeepers. That was accidental. That came with power, and when they took that role, there were no more gatekeepers. So that's, I think, the first thing. The second is speak up. Don't be quiet. If you're being attacked, don't just report it. Speak loudly about it. We need to create communities that support each other. And all the communities ultimately that are being attacked should come together. And I think that's what you're seeing. I mean, look, I'm Asian American, and I actually have never, there's the perfect example of violence against in a community, when our identities are being used, are being weaponized against us, when hate is the medium that is used to gain power. I think the other part is understanding how our emotions, which have become weaponized, how do we study this? How can this be a powerful tool for good rather than, how do we intellectually analyze something that is so powerful? I don't think we've gotten there yet, but that's something, right? Emotions can be powerful in a whole different way from what we're seeing right now.
Jonah Berger's book on Contagious had put forward that, right? There are other arousing emotions that make content move, like joy and awe, but we're not necessarily tapping into those quite the same way. Shireen, how would you make the internet safer for women?
So I can do a dissertation on this, but my first thing is, I tell people all the time, my motto is there is no tech fix for the human condition, right? What we have to do with tech is deal with the humans that are going to be using the tech and not the tech itself. I think a lot of times the way we've been building tech, this is one of my biggest pet peeves, is that we've been building tech with the concept that it's the tech that's the most important key part, that it's going to solve, racial equality, solve economic inequality. But that's not going to happen because it's about our society and how our society operates. But if you're building it with the concept that you're going to build the tech and somehow nudge the humans around the tech. That's why what you said earlier, Alicia, which is, people who, whether it's the reporting system is in play in a certain way, humans are going to use it for something else. And until we accept the fact that everything that gets built can be used for something good as well as something bad, and try to look at the threat modeling of what is possibly bad that can happen, we can't have a good internet and we can't have a good system of technology. We are having a hard time understanding that when it first started, it was like this utopia of what tech can do for the world, and we've now seen that, right, with the Social Dilemma and other, which by the way, I call Social Dilemma the White Tech Boys redemption documentary, just FYI, is to say that you realize now how harmful it was being to humans, but we're not doing anything on the other side as we're building and trying to counter it about what we're going to do different. Because what we need to be doing is deal with how humans are, good and bad, and build the tech around that.
I am such a big proponent of red teaming, not just the tech that you're developing, but also the interventions and countermeasures that are happening, right? Because again, like back to the user reporting, it's not often thought through how they're going to be used differently than intended. Luiza, what big change would you make to try to make the internet safer for women?
I think I would start by saying that the internet doesn't need to be a place that is not safe for women. Right now, during the pandemic, when lockdown measures were taken last year at the beginning, we have seen like it was a huge problem in Latin America because there were many women that were locked at their houses where they suffer domestic violence. And we have seen many WhatsApp messages or many people mobilizing online to try to tell these women, okay, you can report this through the internet, And this was a community initiative that I've seen, and it was very useful. So I think this is it. Like, we're not going to make the internet safer if we don't change the structures. It's a structural issue. We do not have a word that is the internet that can be safe for women, while the real world is not safe for women, right? So we need to have more women thinking about policy, both in tech companies, but also in politics. We need to elect more women. We need to just change how society views women so that these issues can be addressed.
The internet is so much like a mirror, right? Like a carnival mirror. It's everything that we have in the real world. It's just distorted and different and faster and more intense. And I think that's often a point that's lost, Luiza. So thank you. We do have a question from the audience. It seems to be possible if we took attacks against women online more seriously, this could contribute to how we counter influence operations more broadly. Curious what each of you think of that. Maria, do you want to?
I'll first, I just want to add that, I think the pendulum swing, because there's always a pendulum swing for anything new. And I think the pendulum swing of technology has gotten to its worst, I hope the worst point, because that means then it will begin to swing back. Tech isn't any longer, I think Shireen, you and Luiza, you talked about tech as something about human nature. I think it's worse. I think it's designed to manipulate now. Social media has become a behavior modification system that actually preys on the worst of our biology. And there's that great quote by E.O. Wilson, the American biologist, who said that our greatest problem is our Paleolithic emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technology. So given that, the tech now has turned us into Pavlov's dogs. And without, let's just say the guys in Silicon Valley are all good guys. They would be good guys if they had stopped it sooner. But let's just say, right, now they've seen the impact on the world. We've certainly felt it. Myanmar, you're still seeing genocide. You're seeing the splintering apart of identity in the United States, and hate turning on each other. How do they take into account those embedded ideas, the conspiracy theories, the seeded biases that are there, that actually is in the worst of human nature, but then becomes distributed far more, like a virus that becomes contagious. So sorry, I didn't really answer that, but I'm not sure if I'm getting that in the right words, but I think that the social media platforms have gone beyond just reflecting. It is actually creating, and it is creating bad emergent behavior of society as a whole. And if we recognize that, then we can make the pendulum swing back, right? Because it's January 6th, I hope, in the United States is enough of a wake-up call. If it isn't, it's very clear that the 74 million, that people now believe these conspiracy theories, and it will take time to rehabilitate them. Rehabilitation takes far longer, and those biases, the hatred, is there, and it will lash out in unpredictable manners. So if you do take that kind of hate, the misogynistic attacks. I mean, if you look again, the study of ICFJ that was against me, 40%, so 60% was just meant to tear me down as a journalist, so that you don't believe anything that I write. And I've been doing this a very long time, right? So tear down journalism. The other 40% were all about, they were sexist, misogynistic, very explicit language. They talked about the way I looked. They manipulated images. They put my head, one of their favorite quotes for a period of time was to call me scrotum face because I have dry skin. And they put my face on a scrotum, right? This was waking up to this on a daily basis, just like made me go, okay, well, you're really nasty. But here's the other part, made me stronger. So of course I was sensitive because I have dry skin, but I do have dry skin. And now I've been forced to embrace it. And okay, it's not going to be used. I won't let you attack me with that. Sorry, I talked too long.
No, but again, these attacks that are happening on women, they are a gateway to be able to identify the wider campaign that took offense to whatever light shining was happening on it. Are there other ways in which you think those patterns might be able to enlighten us on how influence operations work more broadly? Luiza?
Yes, I think definitely we can look at what's happening and try to understand, because I think above all, there is an intent there, and the goal is to lower the credibility of institutions. So Maria was talking about attacks against her as a journalist. So the attacks are not, of course, they're against her, but they're trying to make the entire society not believe in journalists. And what we're seeing in Brazil right now, for instance, there are many attacks on scientists, especially women scientists. Why? Because there's a pandemic and the president does not believe or does not treat it seriously, and 3,000 people are dying per day. So we can see how are the patterns, we can study, and we can try to understand what is the goal and the motivation behind it. And as we were talking in the beginning, there are different motivations, right? There are political motivations, geopolitical motivations, but when you study the patterns that are used against women, I think it's a good way of understanding what is the motivation behind, what is the main goal, and how it works. And then we can try to start implementing policy, trying to change policy, trying to shape research that is going to affect not only how women are being targeted by that, but how all the entire society is being targeted by that.
So for me, I'm definitely going to say yes to that question. And I said from our research, I actually have a pin on my Twitter account that says that if anyone had listened to Black women, we wouldn't even have what we had in 2016, but we sure as heck wouldn't have had what we had in 2020. And so had they recognized the targeting, us, speaking out about it, understanding what was happening, and not seeing it as unimportant until it happens on a larger scale, like what Gamergate was. We could have stopped this long before this. We could have stopped this in 2013 and 2014. But because we were not seen as the most important to protect, it was able to be tested on us and then built on a different set of systems. So what I look at now is patterns that were built on from 2013 to present. And if you don't understand those patterns, you don't know what you were looking at, or you don't understand the history of those patterns, or who were the original targets, you won't be able to solve the problem anyway. So that's also the big key to this. So yes, if we look at that, if we look at women being targeted and how they're being targeted, we can see how that then gets to be manufactured towards other groups. For example, there was one campaign that started after an event called Black Girls Rock, called Stop Black Girls. And it started out as a campaign focused specifically on trying to dehumanize and discredit Black women who were celebrating their their excellence, their expertise, and the like. The fact that there was an immediate campaign to counter that is already a tell there. But then it moved on to other groups of women. And so if you don't watch those patterns and see that now there was a hashtag to stop, Asian women, stop Latin women, like it becomes a pattern after that. And then it moves on into other frameworks depending on how it's handled. Actually, you can still go look back and see some of the stuff from Stop Black Girls is still online when some of those, we were told all those things would be, removed. So it's that kind of thing that we are not understanding, because once that is acceptable, when women are talking about, for example, on platforms like Facebook, where they're speaking out against being called the N-word, and the person who's speaking out against the N-word is the one that gets banned and suspended, but the person who actually use it, nothing happens. We are not understanding the juxtaposition of the systems that we're so-called asking to change. We're still embedding certain aspects of that. And yes, if we focus on women, we can address a lot of these problems and could stop it from morphing. So as far as I'm concerned, what happened, what we were tracking, again, Stop the Steal, Walk Away, all those things turned into campaigns that targeted Black women in particular. And what we saw that happen in Georgia, the way that they're targeting the Black women in Georgia now, is all based on the aftermath of that.
Yeah. And it bears repeating, although you have both all mentioned it multiple times, this is happening all the time. It is not new. This is what women are facing all the time online. And so it's not hard to discover and understand more. I'll ask two more questions, one more from the audience and one just as a wrap-up question. What do you think would make for better collaborations between social media platforms, journalists, and women researching these topics? What might be a better approach? Maria?
We work closely with all the platforms. We're one of two Filipino fact-checking partners of Facebook. It's important to do fact-checking, even though that's like putting your finger and the dam is about to burst, because our research team identifies the lie, and then we look at the networks that spread the lies. YouTube, Twitter, I guess the first step is realizing that making sure they understand the problem. I think over 4 or 5 years now, it's been 5 years, they do understand the problem. Now it's actually getting to a point where the actions they're willing to take have any kind of impact on the problems that we're facing. Because so far, what we've seen for a very long periods of time are very palliative efforts that really haven't dealt with it. So let me give you an example of something that does work. Identifying influence operations, and I'll talk about the takedown of Facebook in September 2020. Taking down 2 influence operations, one from the Philippines that was connected to the police and military. They were essentially tagging press freedom groups, human rights organizations, opposition politicians as terrorists. So this network was taken down by Facebook. It was something that Rappler brought up, started writing about it in May. The second influence operation was coming from China. And this influence operation was targeting all of Southeast Asia, was creating fake accounts for the US elections. This was September. And Facebook took this down. They were using AI-generated photos for the US presidential elections. Well, both of these influence operations were targeting me, and Facebook let me know that as well. So again, I think, we work with them. I think they know what is happening. I would love to see better, faster, more effective, more systematic.
Shireen, how would you have them collaborate better with journalists and researchers?
So I do think that, because I work with a network of women who are also researchers and journalists, and I try to constantly keep them informed of our research. I would say for our perspective on the work is the focus on what happens to Black women is not a priority for them. So these campaigns, unfortunately, the actions that they're taking, and I've been inside trying to get them to understand what's happening that's different, how we're being targeted, and how that impacts the elections. What we've been struggling with is something that Maria said. If it's an external network the Chinese network or others, they'll take action. But if it's a domestic network, they won't. And so we're facing a very different challenge here in America because they're American companies. And so those who are targeting us, who happen to be politicians or are part of even the Russian network that has, what we found, in our work, we discovered those 3,500 ads were targeting Black identity, period. And they didn't take those down. We still see problems with that, right? But we also now see domestic actors doing the exact same thing. What did they say about what the last person who was in office? There was a whole deterrence campaign, right? Focused on Black voters. So if you can't see that part of it to figure out how to take down parts of those networks, then for us, there's no solve at this point. We can collaborate, but if you don't think that it's important enough to take down content, for example, content that's basically targeting, the Black Lives Matter people or those who are trying to get out the vote. Like, getting out the vote should not be a partisan issue. But if you're allowing those people to be targeted, then we're really not having the type of solutions here. And what I've been up against and facing all the time is that as long as it's foreign, they will act as quickly as possible. But when it's domestic, we almost get no reaction. And that has been consistent. And until we deal with that, as a matter of fact, the most we hear is the conservative bias thing, right? That we've seen testimonies about that. But what happens to us, how our voices are silenced, you hear zero about it. So that's part of the narrative. And we've seen that Facebook can and has an AI that can take down hate speech. But why do they not use it and why they don't deploy it? Because one political group will be taken down more than another. But you're not saying the real word there. Hate speech. So you're saying that one group is participating in hate speech from a political perspective, but you are not using your AI to effectively take them down when you know you have it. It's supposed to be even. If any group participates in hate speech, that content comes down. So if you're telling me you're not going to use it or implement it because you know one group is participating and peddling hate speech more than the other, you're also saying something else to us. Not only do you know it, but you're not willing to protect us from it.
That's a great point. Luiza, do you want to bring us home on this?
Yes, just talking about the same invisibility that I think Shireen is pointing there, or not invisibility, but mostly lack of action. I think this is something that people that are in other countries face a lot. So sometimes it's very hard to say, okay, this is happening in my country. My country is small. Maybe it's not the most important country geopolitically to the US where the companies are based, but this is affecting my country and democracy here. Please act. I think there is a lot of, it's very hard to do that. And the other thing that I would say is maybe on the part of journalists, from their perspective. I know that journalists, it's very stressful to be a journalist right now. The industry is falling apart. Basically, people are facing many, many difficulties. But I think sometimes journalists also have to understand a little bit more about the field. So I'm going to give an example. In 2018 in Brazil, when we were having many problems with WhatsApp, many people, many journalists were saying, why is WhatsApp encrypted? But they were not thinking that we need to protect privacy, and we have many activists that are using encrypted apps just to protect themselves. So I think there needs to be more collaboration and more talks, I think social media companies and journalists, they have to collaborate and talk more to understand where each other are coming from, so that they can actually inform the other one and help. For instance, this work that Maria was pointing out, the takedown last year, we worked as researchers on this takedown. The Day for Lab worked on it, and it came from you, it came from journalists. So I think this would also help a lot with this issue of countries where there are no, social media companies are not based there.
Thanks. An hour is obviously not long enough to do this important topic justice. Thank you, Maria Ressa, Luiza Bandeira, and Shireen Mitchell for joining us today. You are all very inspiring, and we appreciate the insights you shared today. Given the importance of the topic, we are inviting other women researching and countering influence operations to share their experiences with us on Twitter. Our account at IO Partnership will post a thread with a video from today's panel and encouraging you to share those insights. So there'll be a thread of questions. 3 other amazing women researching in this space will join us this Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for a public panel on unmasking influence operators. What are the best practices for attribution? So join BBC's Mariana Spring, Elise Thomas from the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, Olga Belagalova from Facebook, as well as Emerson Brooking from DFR Lab for what should be another engaging discussion. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.